All right. Crouch a little bit. I don't know if I'm a little taller than the average family presenter. Not that tall. Anyway, bring this up actually, so I know who's in the room. But welcome and good morning. We're happy to have you with us today. I just want to. No, it's okay. It's okay. I just wanted to start our time since it's already 10:06 now, and begin with some time for personal introductions. You know, because this is a mini symposium, that word "mini" or that word fragment enabled us to be a lot more laid back. But I made sure to wear a blazer in case Dr. Goldie happens to walk by. So, because underneath I have a T-shirt that says adobo on it. But anyway, we want to begin by greeting you. Welcome to the Filipino American Ministry Initiative, aka the FAMI Mini-Symposium for 2023 Filipino American History Month. Our theme for this year is Filipino American Faith After 1898, and that is in conjunction with Filipino American National Historical Society's theme, which is 1898, 125 years of Philippine and American history. So we are going at that from the perspective of Christian ministry, faith, theology, community, etc. And we had some great presentations in this lineup over the last few weeks, beginning with Reverend Dr. Altizon, who spoke to us, and we have that recorded. We'll share it in the next few weeks or so. And then after him, after all his insights from his perspective as a former missionary to the Philippines, who in a way was a balikbayan, which is returning back to the mother country. He was born in the United States, but then served as a missionary for 10 years among the poor in the Philippines. He gave us a lot of great insights. And one of the quotes that he said that stuck out to me was that he said he hopes for a day when there will be no more victims of the Great Commission. And I thought that was really thought-provoking and also insightful, especially from a missiologist. And then last week, Dr. Jordan Ryan came to join us for our online event on Thursday. And he shared a lot about the Roman Empire and about its significance for the United States and the American Empire's presence in the Philippines, which relates very much to Filipino American Christianity and the forces that have shaped and still continue to shape it to this day. And then we started yesterday with our in-person portion of the symposium and had a great kickoff here in person on the Pasadena campus from Denise Peña Cruz, who presented about some possibilities for the future of Filipino American pneumatology. So that is kind of an exciting area where many of us recognize a need for more theological work, especially as it relates to ministry and even Christian living. How do we develop a spirituality and a way of being together that is consistent with who God made us and the stories of God's movement in our families' lives, right? And not simply skip over or replace those important foundations that have maybe for too long been ignored or demonized, literally demonized. So that was exciting. And again, that's recorded. And then after that, Paul, AKA KP, presented a poem for us and a lot of great conversation from his perspective as an artist. And I just want to remind you that before we get into today's presentations, we are meeting next Tuesday, and that's not a Thursday, but Tuesday. It's the only gathering out of the whole month that is on Tuesday. We'll meet online for the final segment, and there's three presentations in our mini symposium. So we'll hear from Andrew Ignacio, who is currently in an intentional Christian community in South Carolina. In Georgia, outside of Athens, Georgia, I think it is. And he'll share a poem with us, and we'll also get to hear from Suzanne Pickard, who's with us right now and whose screen is with us in the room. And she's got a lot to share. I won't get into it all right now because I don't want to spoil it. And then also Carl Catedral, who is one of our FAMI alum who's been serving and living for a long time in Hong Kong, will share with us about some of the experiences he's had trying to put to work all that he's learned at Fuller, and from his experience as a Filipino American, his perspective as a Filipino American, with his current activism and advocacy alongside Filipina domestic workers in Hong Kong. So there's a lot of exciting things that are happening there. I was able to visit him this past summer and was really excited for what is happening in Hong Kong. All right, so having said all that, oh yes, my name is Gabriel J. Katanis. I'm the director of FAMI, and I'm happy to be here on campus to be sure that we are together in person in some way, in addition to our online gatherings. And I want to begin with introductions. So we were using the remote yesterday. Are we still capable of doing that? And we'll start with the folks all the way to my left. So with our leader at the Asian American Center, who has also earned the nickname Kuya Daniel, AKA Ninong, because he's not just the sponsor to ensure our good, but also has literally been a supporter in even our ability to do this work. So yeah, you can turn to, yeah, but tell us your name and your connection to FAMI, and then we'll go to the person next to you.
Yeah, so my name is Daniel Lee. I am the academic team, the Center for Asian American Theology Ministry. I also teach theology and also Asian, well, associate professor of theology and Asian American studies. Next to my family, you know, I must confess that before I hung out with like Jay and you know Joyce, Rosario, and other people, I don't actually really understand Filipino American context that well. It's really hard for East Asians to understand Filipino American context. It doesn't come naturally. So, but Jay and I, we've known each other for how many years now? Like almost a decade, I think. Like,
A long
time. So we've been in contact for a long time and talking, dreaming. And so super excited to keep on really diversifying how we think about Asia. And that's a big priority at the Asian American Center to make sure we do that well. So I don't know if you can hear me. Is it loud enough? I hope so. That's
Suzanne,
me.
can you hear Dr. Lee? Yes. Good.
Okay.
Great.
Yes, I think all of you over there. That's good. Talk loud.
There you go.
Okay, that's me.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Elise, and I am also just a part of the Asian American Center and wanted to learn more about Filipino American life.
Wonderful. Welcome again.
Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Lee. No relation to Daniel Lee. Not this Daniel Lee, at least. And I have been told that I am the unofficial mascot of the AAC.
You'll have to explain.
You were
that.
all Asian American.
You'll have to explain that for everybody who's joining on Zoom.
Yeah, so I am not just Korean, but I'm also Filipino, Japanese, Chinese. If you look at my 23andMe, there's also some Melanesian, Pakistani, Spanish, so that Iberian Peninsula. And so, yes, very representative of the Asian American Center at Fuller.
Wonderful. That's exciting. And that's a very real part of especially the Filipino American experience, is to have families and networks that are very diverse and yet to still embrace each other as kapwa, right? Great. So side.
Hello and good morning. I'm Gillian Garcia. I'm an MDiv student and also I serve as program coordinator at the Asian American Center. Yeah. I'm controlling.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bernard Garcia, Gillian's husband. I'm a Pasadena-based student. I'm in the MDiv program, and I've been involved with the AAC and family for a couple years now. Oh, I'm also the Pastoral Formation Fellow for the AAC.
Yes, we're excited about that. So Suzanne, can we go to you next?
Yeah, sure. And really excited about all the connections I've made with the family and getting part of
It's breaking up. We can't really hear you because you're breaking up. Maybe turn off the video and see if that helps.
Okay,
No,
can
it
you hear
doesn't-
me better now?
Oh,
Yes, we can.
Yes, so I'm Suzanne Pickard. I'm coming from Conway, Arkansas. I'm an MDiv student at Fuller and really excited about all of the connections I've been able to make through FAMI and being able to be part of this mini symposium, even though I'm thousands of miles away. So really excited for today.
Yeah, well, we're glad and excited for your presentation next Tuesday. Thanks, Suzanne. Can we go to Dr. Douglas Lee? Dr. Lee, we'd love to
Hi,
hear you. Yeah,
can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah. Oh, I'm Doug Lee. I'm actually Tim's dad. But I'm also director of Something More Ministries, spiritual formation ministry that I have to people. Also was a former adjunct professor at the seminary down the street, Azusa Pacific, for several years. And I also represent the non-Filipino side of Tim. I'm the everything else. So it's an honor to be here to be with you.
Well, welcome, and we're very honored that you're here and glad to have family joining us for these sessions. That is really part of what we do here also. Can I go to Pastor JP Arseno? Pastor JP, would love
Yes,
to hear
hello.
you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm John Paul Arsena. I'm pastoring a church here in New Jersey. I'm a PhD student at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary that's in Fort Worth, Texas. Yeah, excited to be here as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Excited to see, this is the most we've interacted besides messaging each other on Facebook.
Yeah.
So welcome, brother. And then KP, do you want to introduce yourself again? Even though, yeah, maybe not everyone knew you from yesterday's session. So KP, are you there? Do you want to tell us about yourself?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm KP. I'm a MAT student at Fuller Theological Seminary. I did a presentation yesterday for the Mini-Symposium as well, and excited to see my friends today do their thing.
Awesome. Yeah. Hey, you did your thing yesterday, and so they'll do their thing today. That's right. We just do our thing. Well, so there was some help given to me as I introduced our first presenter, and each of the presenters, shares for about 12 to 15 minutes, although our last presentation today will be a co-presenter, so they'll have a little more time. But they go for about 12, 15 minutes, and then after that we respond to them with follow-up questions with ways to encourage them in their research and their work. And so before or as I introduce this first presenter, I was told to play this music, and I could not object. And now, the starting presenter for the Friday session of our 2023 FAMI Mini-Symposium is Tim Lee. Oh, thank God Dr. Goatley did not walk in. But anyway, Tim is a beloved friend, part of our community, He is, yes, I guess, Mr. Asian American Center now, but has been in ministry for a very long time in so many capacities. I've known Tim since 2016 when we were all at an InterVarsity leadership conference at Berkeley. And it's been good to just stay in touch, but also to see our work overlap and build now in the last few years. So I'll give the floor at this time to Tim.
Thanks, Dr. J. Yes, my name is Tim Lee. I'm a MATM student here at Fuller. I'm based in Southern California. And right now I only have one more class before I finish my degree. So I'm seeing the end of the finish line right now. So I shared a little bit about myself, but the full description of me is I am actually 5th generation Asian American. And to break it down a little bit, I am 50% Filipino, a quarter Korean, an 1/8 Chinese, and an 1/8 Japanese. And I've worked in ministry and in mission organizations for over 10 years, nearly a decade as a campus minister for InterVarsity. And now I work for the Global Fellowship they're a part of, the International Fellowship of Evangelical Students, or IFES, which has student movements in over 180 countries. And the first thing that I want to do is introduce you to some friends. And so pictured here are the Filipino InterVarsity staff of the Southern California region. At the time this picture was taken, it was about 2017. At this time, I was at Cal State Fullerton leading a Bible study specifically for Latino students. It was called La Fe, so Latino Fellowship. But the thing that was interesting is as I was interacting with many of my other colleagues who are pictured here, Ivan was doing ethnic specific outreach to Black students at USC. Meljohn was doing something similar at UCLA. And for some of the other folks who are pictured above, they're at community colleges, state schools, but their student population was very diverse, and also just brought in many underrepresented student populations. And the thing that was really interesting was not only were they able to kind of bring this diversity, but they were also very good at developing leaders among their Black students, Latino students, some of the underrepresented communities there. And I just want to say that the original paper that I wrote on this topic of Filipino Americans as cross-cultural ministers, this was written in 2017. And since then, I've learned significantly more about the Filipino American experience. I've experienced a lot myself. And so I'll include some of those thoughts just going forward. The other thing was my original paper, I took a more objective approach and did not include my own experiences in that. However, I do see that there's a lot that I learned on my own ethnic identity journey that shapes kind of how I see things and how it affects kind of my view of Filipino Americans as cross-cultural ministers. And so what I did was, as I wanted to learn more about this, I set up interviews and used these as standard questions, asking about the demographics of the campus and InterVarsity chapter, lessons that they've learned in terms of cross-cultural ministry and what their personal strengths are. But then I wanted to see what their own reflections were in terms of how those strengths may be connected to Filipino culture, and also understand their context. What was their upbringing like? What was their social groupings like? And then for them as Filipino Americans, what were some of the key events regarding that aspect of identity? And one key event that I will be talking about a couple of times, and Jay himself actually referenced it, is the Kapwa Leadership Institute, or KALI, which is the InterVarsity conference that's specifically for Filipino American students as well as staff. And so while I was interviewing these colleagues of mine, I was also looking into a lot of the research on Filipino Americans and Asian Americans in general, but also within a church and Christian context. But one that I focused on particularly was the book Latinos of Asia by Anthony Ocampo. And so as I gathered this data from both interviews and from my readings, here were the 3 factors that I saw that were very helpful in contributing to Filipino American cross-cultural competency. The first is Filipino American value or Filipino values, and I'll go into greater detail about that later. The second is the aspect of colonialism and migration. And the third part is the racialization of Filipinos in America. And I just want to say that these are based on trends that I was seeing in the interviews as well as what for my readings. And so I don't want to make broad statements about this is what all Filipino Americans experience, but we definitely see the trends here. And I wanted to be able to glean in terms of what does it look like for us to be good cross-cultural ministers. And so the first part, the Filipino values, as I was interviewing my colleagues, what came up again and again and again was hospitality. And one of the interviewees, Michael, said, it's not just an invitation into my home, but an invitation into my life and culture. And honestly, instead of hospitality, I probably could have changed it to food, because there were so many ways that people experience the hospitality of Filipino food, that whenever there's a Filipino gathering, there's so much food. In fact, when you're going to a Filipino gathering, you're not getting fed for that gathering, you're getting stuff to take home, so you get to fed even to the next day, the next meal. There is this relational warmth and care and welcoming when you come to a Filipino gathering or you're welcomed into a Filipino home. One of the interviewees, Coral, she described it as being loved, being welcomed, being embraced as a whole person, having needs met that are both expressed but also unspoken by other people in the community. Another person, Michael, whose quote is above, he talked about how Filipinos go above and beyond in their hospitality, whether it's an overabundance of food, a warm invitation into their home, even for first-time encounters. And I felt like I experienced that myself when I visited the Philippines for the first time. I met a colleague who lived in Iloilo. She picked me up from the airport. She dropped me off for my flight out, but she also hosted a gathering with all of her friends from InterVarsity in the Philippines, from CPU, just for me. And I had just met her one time, and I felt this aspect of hospitality. And see, several theologians actually note the human need for home, for belonging, and that the church can provide that in such a way that it meets these human needs. As I've been thinking about this more, that beyond just the hospitality, because it's more than just Southern hospitality, but it goes deeper. And E.G.R. David, he noted that kapwa is one of the core Filipino values, something that's embodied and passed down and largely unspoken. And as I was reflecting on this more, this kapwa, this unity, this oneness between oneself and another, that I am sharing my identity with you, and this should not be separated. This felt like this was embodied in what Michael was saying, is like, this is not just hospitality that is an invitation into my home, but into my life and culture. And we see that as Filipinos are able to invite others into a sense of home and hospitality and belonging, people feel that sense of unity and oneness. And I think this helps contribute to their effectiveness as cross-cultural ministers. The second part is this, the aspect of colonialism and migration. And so this is a quote from Sung Chan Ra, that the second generation, with their unique ethos and strength, along with those in our churches, have cross-cultural liminal experiences. They will be the ones best equipped to face the next stage of the church. They have the ability to straddle different cultures with greater sensitivity. And I think this is interesting because this is broadly for second generation Asian Americans, but I think that for Filipino Americans, we see that this is a bit more heightened. There's some more advantages from their experience that contribute to this aspect. And so from the colonialism that from kind of Spain, as well as the United States, as well as migration, we see that there's this aspect of adaptability and resilience found in Filipinos and Filipino Americans. They needed to adapt when the Spanish colonized them back in the 1500s. And they showed their resilience when they fought for their freedom in the late 1800s, only for America to colonize them again for the next 50 years. But they were resilient in retaining much of their core values as much as they could, while still adapting to these other cultures that were oppressing them and dominating them. One of the things that's very interesting also is because of the American influence during their time of colonization, Filipinos were able to learn English. They're also able, they were wanting to learn a lot more about American culture. And as a result, that actually eased their migration into the United States when they're coming in droves. And Anthony Ocampo, he notes that unlike other East Asian immigrant communities that created their own ethnic enclaves, Filipinos actually settled in multi-ethnic neighborhoods that seemed to complement their ethnic identity. And these neighborhoods were significantly influenced by the diversity of cultures. And because there's this multi-layered, multicultural experience through colonialism, Filipinos actually feel more at home in the midst of diversity. And it feels like this gives them an additional cross-cultural advantage with a shared immigration experience as Asians. And when I talked to some of the interviewees about this aspect, one of the things they pointed out was their ability to code switch. And many second generation Asian Americans have noted this, but the interesting thing about Filipino Americans is that they saw code switching modeled to them by their parents. You see, Philip, one of the interviewees, he noted that he saw this modeled by his father, that his father was a doctor, and he worked with many different ethnicities in the medical field, spoke multiple languages, so English, Spanish, Tagalog, as well as Ilocano, that he could speak about anything with anyone and readily adapt it to his audience. The thing that was interesting was as I was talking to my friends about code switching and even thinking about myself back then, we saw this as a superpower. Like we could go into any community that we could be able to adapt very quickly. But one thing that we didn't take in consideration is this superpower without a cost? Does it actually take its toll on us? Did it take its toll on our parents, our grandparents when they're migrating to have to switch it up every single time? And we saw that it just started chipping away at us, having to always be on in every different environment that we're in. And it also caused us to ask this question. Well, it's like, why do I need to change who I am for all these other places? And doesn't this just perpetuate this system of Western hegemony, of colonial mentality? And just to put this in the room, a definition of colonial mentality is this idea that this other culture, that one that's the colonizers, that they are better, that they're superior, that they're more desirable, that they're more attractive. And as a result, those who are experiencing colonial mentality have this longing and have this desire to want to be more like their colonizers because it's seen as something better and superior. And so that was something that we were experiencing, this double-edged sword where it's like, yes, we have this cross-cultural competency, but it's coming at the cost of our sense of identity. And this brings me to my third point, the aspect of racialization of Filipinos in America. Anthony Ocampo said this, that to be Filipino was to be racially ambiguous. Filipinos were like racial chameleons. What color they were depended largely on the context surrounding them. One thing that's very interesting about Filipinos is that it's not easy to put them in a box. Because of Spanish colonization, many Filipinos have last names that are sounding very Spanish, very Latino, whether it's Domingo or De Leon or Garcia. People don't easily recognize that they may be from Asia. Also, when you look at their features, they can look very much like East Asian, except maybe some darker skin tones, some other facial physical appearances that might be slightly different. And it makes them very racially ambiguous and unable to kind of categorize them very easily. since writing this paper, I have noticed that over the last 6 years, Filipinos and Filipino Americans have just had a lot more representation in the media, probably a lot more than we're used to. And so some people are a lot more familiar with Filipinos, but they still, this aspect of racialization can be a bit confusing. And in fact, for Filipinos themselves, this is confusing. Ocampo writes that Filipinos often struggle to identify as Asian to the point that they refuse to check off a box in a survey. Or sometimes they see Latino and think that they should fill that one out. Or they see Pacific Islander and fill that one out. But one thing that's difficult is no matter how acclimated they are to this environment, they will still be racialized and perceived as a perpetual foreigner and not ever as fully fledged Americans. And I think this too begins weighing down in their sense of identity, even when trying to cross cultural boundaries. When I was interviewing one of my friends, Ivan, this is what he said that came up for him as he was coming into the reaching out to Black students. He says, as I was entering in, I don't feel like I'm me. I feel like I'm missing a part of me. I need Filipinos who understand where I'm coming from. Otherwise, I don't feel like I can fully fit in, be able to fit in. In another interview, he shared how about their early experiences in cross-cultural ministry. She found herself learning about the culture, but from a place of jealousy. She said that she was longing to be like those she was reaching and thought that their culture is better than hers. And upon her further reflections, this was because she did not realize the value in her own Filipino identity. Earlier, I talked about the colonial mentality where we see this other, culture as being superior and better. But the other flip side of that coin is seeing your own culture, your Filipino culture, your language, your values, your features as inferior, undesirable, and negative. And maybe they weren't trying to be like American culture, but I think that there's that aspect of self-loathing, of self-hatred, of inferiority that carried on even as they're doing ministry cross-culturally, and they saw something that they wanted. And so this brought about just a very big question of identity, which seemed to be a very pivotal point for many of the Filipino Americans who are doing cross-cultural ministry. The Kapwa Leadership Institute, Kali, when they did this in 2013, they had these sermons that were focused on the life of Moses, looking at the book of Exodus. And if you think about it, Moses' life parallels a bit, or we could find some similarities for those of us who are Filipino Americans, where he was born as a Hebrew, his people are exploited and oppressed by world power. He's raised as one in that culture, but then later migrates to a foreign land where he settles down and marries a Midianite woman. But then he has this burning bush moment with God. And here's posed the question, who am I? And this piece of identity is very huge. But as I was pondering about it more, I think when we want to discover and unpack this aspect of identity, it's more than just this aspect, but we should broaden it more. And so here are the 3 areas that I thought could help us unpack this aspect of identity in our own discipleship. And so the 3 areas of focus were this: history, identity, and mission. And as I was pondering about this, of like what cohesive scripture might be helpful in discipling us through these aspects of history, identity, and mission, what I landed on was looking at the life of Jesus through the Gospel of Matthew. And originally for my practice, I was thinking that these could be 3 sermon treatments that could be used for a future Kali conference. I had since left InterVarsity, and so that didn't come to fruition. But now I think maybe these could be Bible study modules for Filipino Americans to unpack some of this aspects of history, identity, and mission. And so for the first part of history, let's look at Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus. And when you look at it, at first it's just a bunch of different names. But when you drill it down further, there's so much richness within all of these different stories. And I want to say that even though, this is specific to the Filipino American experience and kind of what I'm going to be sharing, I do think that these lessons and even the good news is universal as well as local. And when we look at the Filipino American experience and then compare it to this genealogy of Jesus, there are so many different things that we see, whether it's family drama, whether it's scandal, whether it's mixed marriages, whether it's conquest and oppression by other nations, whether it's struggling to survive and the resilience to be able to make it from one generation to the next. I feel like many Filipino Americans can relate with this experience. And not just for their own personal familial history, but also understanding the fuller history of Filipinos and Filipino Americans as a whole. And this feels like it's so rich that there are many ways that we can go about it. We see here that the women are highlighted in a particular way in this genealogy. We can look at the ninangs and madrinas and those who embody this kind of kitchen theology of those who have passed on these values of Kapwa to us. And as I was talking with my Filipino colleagues about this, they noted that there are struggles that we see in terms of Filipino history as well as Filipino American history. It also is something that other ethnic minorities in the US can relate to through their experiences of oppression, discrimination, and this gives these points of contact that we can relate to. And on the aspect of personal family history, many Filipinos are unaware of their own family's history, of how they migrated, why they did. And I feel like being able to hear their family stories, whether from their lolas or their parents, this could be very helpful to bridge aspects and bring healing in places that are necessary, especially for identity. There can be areas of resentment that are untapped because when we start asking why our parents or our grandparents did these things, it might have come out from the necessity to simply survive, whether in the Philippines or in America. In fact, for my own story, I often struggle, why doesn't my mother speak Tagalog? And one of the reasons why is my lolo and lola, they never wanted to speak it unless they were having conversations that my mom and her siblings could not understand. And for me, I feel like I'm losing on this precious language, but for them, they wanted to do the best for their children to succeed, and to succeed meant to assimilate as best as possible. And so we see that history can help fill in this gap, help us understand our history, not only through our own family, but through our collective identity as Filipino Americans. And I think that can help with our own understanding with identity as well. The second part is this aspect of identity itself. And we're looking at the temptation and, the temptation as well as the baptism of Jesus, where here are these two phrases juxtaposed. This is my son with whom I love, with him I'm well pleased. That's coming from God at the baptism, versus if you are the son of God, that is said multiple times by the devil in these times of temptation. And for Filipino Americans, I feel like we straddle this area of, well, if you were Filipino enough, then ... Well, if you were American enough, ... We may even feel this pressure as Asian Americans as if you were Asian enough, ... But then we add the layer of colonial mentality, this aspect of inferiority where it's like, well, if you were desirable, if you were better, if you were acceptable, and we hear those empty promises of the empire, these unattainable American dreams, and it's these temptations that are saying, you will never be what you want to be. You will never be enough. And it begs the question, can we identify these voices that are straying us, that are pulling us in this direction? Now contrast to this aspect of God the Father saying to Jesus, this is my son who I love, with him I'm well pleased. Here we see that before Jesus has done anything, before he's done any public ministry, he is being affirmed as loved and as a son of God. For us as Filipinos, have we been able to enter that space where our identity is affirmed? I remember when I went to my first Kali conference and I introduced myself as Tim. Hi, I'm Tim. I'm 50% Filipino. One of the staff there, his name was David De Leon, went up to me. He's like, "You are Tim. You are 100% Filipino." And that did something for me where now I wasn't just thinking about my identity as a Filipino as something that I give a half measure to, something that I need to divvy up between all these things, but I am fully Filipino. I am fully Korean. I'm fully Chinese. I'm fully Japanese. I'm fully American. And all these identities are something that can be affirmed in me and that I can learn more about. One of the most pivotal quotes that was shared in terms of this Kali 13 conference came from Joe Ho, who was at the time the director of Asian American Ministries in InterVarsity, but it's "Don't conform to the norm, but glory in your story." So many ways we may feel like we are being pulled to the societal norms, our cultural norms, in order to be filling in that gap of if you are enough, then ... But when we see that God has created us, that we are loved, that we all have our individual paths and stories, that this gives us so much freedom in how we can operate and how we can live and how we can love. And this became something that was very important as I was talking to my Filipino American friends, that it validated every person's unique identity and experiences. And I believe we need to be able to search out those places where our identity, our story is being able to be affirmed and not being conflicted with if you are enough, being pulled in this direction and that. And lastly, the aspect of mission. I thought of Matthew 28. And this may be a very common, almost to the point of cliche passage of the Great Commission, that go therefore and make disciples of all nations. But when we look at the broader ministry of Jesus, even though the Gospel of Matthew is very Jewish, we see Jesus doesn't limit himself. He looked to the marginalized, the oppressed, those who are unclean, that were untouchable, whether it's the Garcia demoniac, the Canaanite women, or even feeding the multitudes in non-Jewish women, or in non-Jewish regions, sorry. But we see that Jesus is leading his followers and commanding them only where he himself has gone before. But as I think about these interactions, these cross-cultural interactions, even more, I think about his interaction with people like the centurion, the people that are in power, that even though this person is an oppressor, and even though there is very good reason for Jesus not to like him, Jesus does go the route of relationship and healing. And even we think about the author of Matthew himself, who is a tax collector, someone who very much looks like Jesus, but comes from a very different world, where he speaks like them, he may look like them, but he doesn't think like the way that they do. In fact, his mentality is seeing prosperity in the empire. He is bought into the dream. He can be seen as an opportunist and profiting off of culture. And I wonder if there are ways that we as Filipino Americans can use a prophetic imagination of seeing those who are other, seeing those who are not of our culture, being able to bring them into the fold. And I say all these things that these are not necessarily a roadmap of how to do cross-cultural ministry, but I want them to be opportunities for us to use our prophetic imagination. As we see how Jesus did ministry, how can we do ministry similarly? Who are those people that kind of fit those contexts? And so I just want to thank you, all of you, for being able to listen to what I was able to share about Filipino Americans as cross-cultural ministers. This is still something that I'm wrestling with myself and want to fully unpack, or what I should say is unpack more fully, to be able to bless Filipino Americans, but then those who are in their communities as well. And so thank you, and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you, Tim. That was great. Well, we have about 12 minutes for questions and responses. And again, if you're joining us on Zoom, we would also love to include you. So you can use the chat and I can read them for you, or you can unmute if you. Yeah, any questions or responses to to Tim's presentation. I'll go first so we can get the ball rolling, but I really appreciated the way you acknowledge the shadow side of the work. I think that there are often idealized versions of how Filipino Americans or Filipinos globally can enter into other contexts and cultures and then do missional work or ministry. And I am always having conversations with people about that. But I appreciated that you acknowledged the shadow side of that. What is the cost for this? Code switching, for example, among other things. And then I appreciated how pastoral your presentation was. So I was listening to you thinking like this has direct application to people in my church. I'm a pastor of a predominantly Filipino American church. It's mostly second generation, and these questions are very live. And I appreciated that you rounded what you're doing in scripture and in the work of ministry. So yeah, thanks for that. Other questions or responses that folks have?
Oh, Tim, thank you for your presentation. Sorry, Tim, thank you for your presentation. That was great. I appreciated your slide connecting colonialism to migration. Highlights the connection of migration to the history of US imperialism and colonization in the Philippines, which challenges the dominant narrative of American exceptionalism that immigrants wanted to come to the US.
Yeah.
So that was really good. And I also appreciated how you took ownership of the fullness of your identity. Like you're 100% Filipino, Japanese, American. All of that comes to who you are.
Yeah. And I think for your kind words. I do think that many people who are, the product of mixed relationships, mixed marriages, they deal with this aspect of identity and struggle. Do they lean one way? Do they lean the other? Do they divide it up equally? And I think it's very similar to thinking about Jesus's identity as 100% human, 100% divine, that this is us embodying our fullness. How are we able to pursue that and go on that journey to learn about ourselves? And sometimes we sell ourselves short where I need to straddle both ways or do something, but I think that's part of reconciling all those things within ourselves and learning that, oh, this is who God created me to be, that I'm not an accident, but how can I fully live into that? Yeah.
Definitely no accident. Yeah. I want to turn to Suzanne, who raised a question in the chat. Do you have any advice for addressing that shadow side of cross-cultural ministry for those who are in the midst of it? I'll read it again so you can take it in. A good question. Thanks, Suzanne. Do you have any advice for addressing that shadow side of cross-cultural ministry for those who are in the midst of it?
So I'm kind of have like two thoughts where it's like there's a shadow side of the person doing ministry, the Filipino American who's doing cross-cultural ministry, where there's a shadow side of code switching, the shadow side of colonial mentality. But I also wonder if there's the shadow side of what's the effect that this has on those that we're ministering to. Are we inadvertently becoming colonizers by kind of having and exercising this authority? But let me start with, I think that some of those aspects of the shadow side, I'll point back to those three modules, those three pieces of scripture of how are we able to better understand ourselves and I think know who we truly are, those shadow sides. And so in that aspect of code switching and identity, we think about that racial chameleon that Anthony Ocampo talked about. It's like, well, what if we're switching colors so many times and adjusting to our backgrounds, we forget what our true colors are? I think that it's important. I think that it's, very important for us to have those spaces where we are with people like other Filipino Americans who can affirm our identity, who can affirm our story to give validation, because sometimes it feels like the stories that we have when we're in cross-cultural context, it feels like we're not given the validation that we need, or are we making too big of a deal for this? And so I think that it's a play, having those safe places where we can have our concerns, where we can say, this is what's taking its toll on me, where we could have these discussions and then do the journey together, because I don't think that any of us are fully in that place where we are, have exhausted our shadow side. But I think being able to do it within the context of community definitely helps us progress farther and together. The other aspect I think is, just aspects of spiritual disciplines, because I know that a lot of my Filipino American friends who are doing this ministry, they're stretched really thin, whether they're working on multiple campuses, whether they have an ethnic specific ministry and a multicultural or a multi-ethnic ministry, and just lots of demands on the life. And so spiritual practices such as Sabbath, rest, going to Jesus so that the voices that we hear are not from our students or from the people that we're ministering to, but having our identity affirmed as beloved from him first and foremost. I think those are aspects for us to be able to counter the ways that the shadow side may be kind of creeping its way into our lives. So I hope that's helpful for, it helps address that question that you had, Suzanne.
That's good. And this particular aspect of like thinking the people we minister to, like you admiring and desiring their culture, I just found it really interesting. I never thought of it that way. And next thing, I think sometimes like in cross-cultural mission kind of thing, we always think about like the person that's kind of colonizing, that thinks highly of themselves, and then they do other stuff, right? And because often it's like, the white person actually ministering to different people in a sense. But because Filipinos are able to like negotiate and navigate so many dimensions, but what ends up happening, like in this other part, we just said, well, what is the cost to ourselves? What do we bring? Or what does it look like? What we don't really value ourselves, right? It's like a very particular discipleship and kind of a maturation process for our spiritual lives to think about that aspect of it, right? Because this whole relationship back and forth, whether we're overvaluing ourselves and we want to project ourselves, or we are not really seeing who we are, therefore we're kind of desiring, in a sense, other cultures. I think that can actually, that can't be good.
No, yes.
It's going to have some, strange dynamics, spiritual dynamics we look into. So I thought that part of it.
Yeah.
I think especially if you're thinking about theorizing this as a practitioner and seeing that particularly, I thought that was really insightful.
Yeah. So just kind of follow up on that. I wonder if this is, the further legacy of colonialism and even the colonial mentality, where maybe the first generation, the older generation, they're the ones who are aspiring to be more like Americans. But maybe it could be the second generation where like, that's a myth, we reject it. But that aspect of inferiority hasn't passed on, where it's like, oh, but us as Filipinos, that feels like it's inferior still. And so therefore I'm going to look for these other cultures where it's like, oh, like, for example, I'm reaching out to the Black culture and like, oh, wow, this, they're so cool in ways that they're able to shape pop culture and culture around us. I recently visited the Philippines, and even though they have not been colonized, in the last few decades, what I noticed was what many Filipinos wish they were or want to be like is actually South Koreans. Because of the prevalency of social media, of K-pop, of K-dramas, it's like they don't want their skin lighter to be more like Americans. Maybe that was a root, but now they want it to be more like Koreans. Now they wish that instead of being born in the Philippines, they were born in Korea. And I wonder if this is now the legacy that colonialism left us, is still this aspect of inferiority. But instead of looking to the American empire, we're looking to all these other things that are becoming whatever is most prevalent in our locality.
Had a lot of discussion about that in Fuller's Asian American Center as well, about East Asian hegemony. It's not just here in the United States, but very much a global phenomenon, regional as well. Right?
East Asians are white people of Asian Americans. You just have to own it. You just have to own it, and you have to be like, you just have to realize the fact that it comes with privilege, comes with power, you have to figure out what that looks like. If you don't own it, you know, then you end up just like the people we're complaining about. We had a Korean American professor said, well, there aren't that many, you know, like Indian Americans, who cares? And I was like, Asian Americans are 6% of the population. What if other white people said, we don't care because you're 6%? How would you argue back? So you can't use the same argument against Indian Americans or Filipino or Vietnamese Americans or whatever. It's like, it's really a problematic argument. But I mean, it's very easy to think that way. So,
Yeah.
Apparently Indian Americans are the largest Asian Americans.
yeah, within the context, right? But I think institutionally people can be very blind because, you know, especially in Protestant or evangelical Christian context, how much room East Asians take up. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And actually, even the Asian American context, it's about money and power. You think about how big like India is. I mean, the Philippines is humongous, but money and power, South Korea at this particular time. So you have to think about that. How does that work? And how our attractiveness to the other and desiring other cultures really it's kind of, you know, it's within the frame of like capitalism in terms of what is desirable, what is worth something. I think it's, I mean, now everybody Korean wants to be Korean. My generation, none of us want to be Korean. We're like, no.
Yeah.
Like that was like maybe Japanese, but nobody wanted to be Korean. That's what David Chang is like, oh, I want to be Korean. I mean, Chinese growing up. I mean, Japanese growing up. He went to Japan to study, right? He went to Japan to study Japanese culture because Korean culture wasn't cool enough for him. So you think about that, it's changing. I think it might change where Filipino culture might just be to stand on. But it's all this political powers that's happening. We need to acknowledge that.
Yeah. Well, can we thank Tim again for his presentation? Wonderful. We're gonna take a 4-minute break before we hear our last presentation for this session and for this week. But yeah, for folks who are online, we'd love for you to stick around, and otherwise we'll see you back here at 11:07 Pacific time. All right. wonderful people behind me. You don't have to say anything, but these are just our our familia. Kristen and Denise. Denise presented yesterday and happened to be sitting behind me, which is the worst for them because I'm on camera. And Suzanne and Pastor JP Arsenault are logged in, and so is KP. And look at that, I got a crowd behind me, and they're all on screen right now. Well, briefly, before we move into our last presentation and discussion, I just want to acknowledge that there's a Pew Research report out on Asian Americans and religions. And so I was able to be part of the interviews for that article from Christianity Today reflecting on the report. But I thought that it would be worth just acknowledging the report, that we can check it out and do our work, hopefully with data and not simply relying on anecdotal evidence as we try to argue for or against certain ministry practices and theologies, but really try to, follow good theological method and what, Dr. Lee has modeled for us in his book and in his work, and try to work from within the context, really try to be contextual and not simply rely on things that are outside of the context and then project them into or onto our people in ways that, as we've heard already in all of the presentations, can be quite damaging, but also dishonoring of the image of God that is alive in our communities. I know I don't have to get into a long spiel about that, but I do want to just commend the report to you, okay? Check it out. It'll inform the way we do our work and should update also what we write about and how we talk about it. But one thing that Jerry Park emailed me just to let me know, he's a sociologist of religion at Baylor and a friend of ours, but he wanted to remind me that, the report highlights percentages within Asian America and commitments of ethnic groups to religions such as Christianity and other disaffiliation from Christianity also. But percentages are not the same as populations. And that to me was something that's really important because, for example, this was him talking, not me, but I think Dr. Lee will totally be fine with me saying this. The Korean American community is still very Christian as well. And yet the Filipino American community, also very Christian, is more than twice the size of the Korean American community. So there's something like 90% of Filipino Americans identifying either as Christian or as closely affiliated with Christian, if not Christian in identity. And so what that means for us is that if our community is 4.5 million large now, then there are 4 million Filipino Americans who identify as Christian or close to Christian. And what that means then for how we do our work and think of ourselves in the midst of this context of the United States, and then of course cross-culturally, globally as well, is really significant. And for me, what I'm thinking about as we do this is the next generation. How do we do our work in a way that serves our communities and the next generation of Filipino American Christians, whether they be in Filipino American churches or ministries, or whether they be, as they could very well be, in non-Filipino contexts? I think that we've recognized that that's very likely and common, and yet our folks, our kababayan, our loved ones are spread out across the country and highly likely to still identify as Christian. So that is, to me, still quite promising. And I just want to remind us of this, okay? And acknowledge the data, but also what is the other data not being told by percentages, that we can know the percentages are part of the story, but not the whole story. That's what I told CT. So anyway, did you want to add anything to that, Dr.
Yeah, I mean, so sometimes what I'll do is I'll look at the demographic numbers and I'll overlap that with the percentages, and then I'll show that chart. What I'm saying is, like, if Korean Americans like demographically, like, a couple million, and then you have Filipino, but percentage wise it might be more Korean American, but then Filipino Americans might be like 80%. by looking at the numbers, you actually kind of have to see and put up all the numbers together.
Yes.
And then you actually get an accurate account of what's happening, right? So that basically means we take the latest census information and overlap that with the percentages. And then you'll see very clearly what's happening, right? Or clearly, like, it'll give a picture of what's happening, right? And also, like, it's important to kind of keep on thinking about the Catholic versus Protestant versus evangelical, because that gives you a picture of what it looks like as well. I mean, I guess the important thing about that is that we live in often evangelical bubbles. So demographic of that is not necessarily Christian, like Christianity altogether. Asian American Christianity is bigger than us. It's important to think about that. And 7As, of course, are even more warped because it's about particular people who value education, who basically think about that. So what we experience in this circle is not what it is in terms of even evangelicalism, Asian American evangelicalism, and then even in terms of Asian American Christianity. Just we have to keep that in mind.
That's good. Great. Okay, well, having said that, and given our time, I want to introduce our co-presenters who will give the final presentation for our in-person component of our mini-symposium. I don't know what more can be said because they've already introduced themselves, but we're excited to hear from Gillian and Bernard at this time as they close out our in-person portion of the symposium. So, welcome.
Good morning, everyone. As Dr. J said, I'm Bernard. I'm originally from this area, grew up near Pasadena, but I moved to the Philippines 9 years ago, and I lived there for 7 years, but I've been back for 2 years.
And it's quite the opposite for me. I'm Gillian Garcia. By the way, we are married, just to clear that. We're not brothers and sisters. We're not cousins. We checked. And so, yeah, we're partners in ministry and in other aspects of our lives. I was actually born and raised in the Philippines. It was actually just recent that I started to carry on this identity as a Filipino American, having moved my life here. So I'm a recent migrant. So we are presenting this topic, pananampalataya at pakikibaka, which is a Tagalog word that means faith and co-struggling. Pakikibaka is actually, it stems from the word makibaka, which is like onward struggling, onward struggle, that Filipino American activists would like to chant every time they are in protests or rallies. And to them, this word connects them to the activists in the motherland. They say the same chants whenever they're in this protest. So we want to keep this tradition, keeping the words in our presentation. So faith and co-struggling, theological reflections on Filipino American activism.
Yeah. So Dr. J asked us to share some of our learnings and reflections on our experiences engaging in Filipino American activist spaces. And although we were involved in these activist spaces in the Philippines, we were connected to first to Filipino American activist spaces 2 years ago during the first film screening of the Migrant Women Rise documentary, which was produced by our friend and Fuller alumni, Carl Catedral.
So to present this is like going full circle. Every fourth Monday of July, Filipino activists and other concerned civilians would gather to counter the Philippine presidential address. Thousands march in Manila and 1,000 more gather in different parts of the Filipino diaspora for what they called the People's State of the Nation Address, or PSONA. For Filipino Americans, community actions like PSONA allow them to speak on the harsh realities of Filipino people who are subject to neo-colonialism, free market capitalism, and tyrannical regimes. These individuals and organizations not only get information from reliable news outlets and research papers, but they also spend time with migrant workers, farmers, and educators in the motherland and the diaspora, including the rural and urban poor civilians. Filipino American activists' approach to community organizing is very personal, drawing lessons from Philippine American history, their family stories, and racialized experiences as ethnic minorities in U.S. society. They raise funds to support labor cases of Filipino migrant workers,
lobby for policies that will protect Filipino people, such as the Philippine Human Rights Act. They counter misinformation with educational workshops and even provide legal assistance to any kapwa or fellow Filipino in need. These activist groups and community organizers comprise of first to third generation Filipino Americans, from high school students to senior citizens. Some are academics and some are laborers. But one thing that seems to be lacking in these spaces is the presence of the church, specifically the Filipino American clergy and laity. In this paper, we address the state of the Filipino people and identify systems that oppress Filipinos. We revisit Philippine and Filipino American history to trace how these oppressive systems were in place. And then we identify local efforts to counter these oppressive systems. And finally, we offer a theological reframing to highlight why Filipino American Christians should carry on this long history of pakikibaka or co-suffering or co-struggling. And we will conclude with an invitation to mobilize local congregations faithfully. So, the state of the Filipino people. Why should Filipino Americans, especially Filipino American Christians, be concerned with human rights crisis in the Philippines? One may ask, isn't there enough to be concerned about here in the US, such as our own justice-related issues, or the erasure of our history, or the lack of representation in media and academia? And while all these issues are important, it is crucial for Filipino Americans to recognize how their struggles are deeply connected to the social political concerns in the Philippines. In a country of 112.5 million people, about 19.9 million Filipinos are under the national poverty line. And by Philippine government standard, a family of 5 lives off 12,030 pesos per month, which is about $212 US, or 400 pesos a day, which is $7 US. $7 US for a family of 5 to provide for their food and other basic necessities. However, considering inflation and varying standards of living in urban areas, this definition of poverty in the Philippines seems to be worse. Some third-party surveys present that many lower to middle income class households consider themselves poor. And just ask any overseas Filipino worker or OFWs with a college degree the reason why they left the country, and surely they would tell you that escaping poverty is top of their list. To be poor in the Philippines means having barely anything to eat, not having access to health care, and being susceptible to natural disasters such as typhoons and earthquakes that seem to devastate the archipelago regularly. And while many Filipinos are considered poor, the Philippines is rich in natural resources and raw materials that industries clamor for. From pre-colonial times to this day, there is an abundance of gold in the Philippines. In fact, Forbes magazine reports that there is $1 trillion worth of untapped gold sitting all over the archipelago. And this excludes other profitable minerals. This abundance, along with free market capitalism and trade zone policies, has caught the attention of many foreign investors. Mining, agriculture, and cheap labor remain to be the trade assets of the country. In Philippine Society and Revolution, Amado Guerrero argues that there are 3 basic problems that oppress and impoverish Filipinos. And these are feudalism, US imperialism, and bureaucratic capitalism. Take note of these isms. These basic problems did not just emerge after 1898 or at the dawn of US occupation, but they can be traced from 3 centuries of Spanish colonization and even pre-colonial Philippine society. And just a side note, I know that many young Filipinos and Filipino Americans, including myself, may romanticize a pre-colonial Philippines. And while there are ideas and wisdom worth recovering from this period, it is important to consider that classism, slavery, and feudalism were already present in this society. And therefore, this pre-colonial idealization must be carefully examined. Feudalism was the social system in many pre-colonial communities that make up the Philippine archipelago. And due to familiarity with the social system, feudalism was used by the Spaniards to their advantage in conquering the islands, one nobility and warlord at a time. During Spanish occupation, the Philippines' natural resources were extracted and exported as fuel to the Spanish Empire. The peasant class was charged tributes and pressured to produce export goods. Land grabbing was rampant. Catholic friars had excessive political power that they abused, and colonial rulers imposed arbitrary policies to control the Indios or native Filipinos. Colonial oppression provoked several revolts within the 333 years of Spanish occupation, but the Philippine Revolution from 1896 to 1898 was the most successful movement as revolutionaries declared independence on June 12, 1898. However, US interest in the Philippines was also burgeoning during this revolution. On December 10, 1898, the Treaty of Paris was signed by the US and Spain. The US gained possession of Puerto Rico, Guam, and for the price of $20 million, the entire Philippine archipelago. Philippine historians would point to the sword and the cross as the Spaniards' key to conquering the Philippines, and the same can be said about the Americans, only their brand of imperialism is more sophisticated. Considering all the revolts that had transpired throughout Philippine history, be it a failure or a success, there are two ways one may interpret it. First is that Filipinos are a conquered people, and the other is that Filipinos have a long history of resistance. The Philippines transitioned from a direct colonial rule to becoming an independent nation in 1946. However, the US continues to hold an economic and political hegemony over the nation, thus maintaining a neo-colonial rule aimed at reinforcing capitalism, neoliberal globalization, and cultural subjugation. David Harvey notes that neoliberalism proposes that human well-being can be best advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills with an institutional framework characterized by strong private property rights, free markets, and free trade. Neoliberal policies in the Philippines have prioritized the interests of US and multinational corporations over the interests of the Filipino people, leading to the direct opposite of what the philosophy proposes. And so despite the Philippines being rich in resources, the nation continues to suffer from extreme poverty. As mentioned, raw materials and cheap labor are the primary exports of the country, leading to increased profits for the few while depriving many of basic human needs. Corruption within the Philippine government drives a bureaucratic capitalist system, which is a system of government where officials use their positions to enrich their personal wealth, prioritizing the interests of corporations that enriches the capitalist in authority. And this results in the failure to elevate the quality of life of the Filipino people. Now, this explains the mass migration of Filipinos to work abroad just so they can send money back to their families. With high rates of remittances flowing into the Philippines from abroad, government authorities relieve themselves from prioritizing improving the living conditions of Filipino people. Thus, authorities incentivize Filipinos to work abroad, further perpetuating the harsh realities experienced by the masses.
Resisting the powers that be. Voices of dissent are a threat to the oppressive triad of feudalism, US imperialism, and bureaucratic capitalism. However, with the passing of draconian policies such as the anti-terror law, Filipinos who speak in opposition to the Philippine government are subject to impunity, just based on reports about victims of red tagging, those who fight for human rights or resist corporate expansion on indigenous lands, often experience threats even to the point of assassination. Most red tagging victims are not even communists, but are human rights defenders environmental activists, journalists, and even clergy. Furthermore, there are numerous reports of corporations enlisting the armed forces of the Philippines to massacre indigenous communities who refuse to be displaced from their ancestral land. They are justified to do so by labeling them as communists. This increased militarization of the armed forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police is funded by US security assistance. According to the US Department of State, since 2015, the US has provided the Philippines with almost $500 million in security assistance. Through the lobbying efforts of Filipino American activists, the Philippine Human Rights Act was reintroduced to the US Congress in July 2022. This piece of legislation calls for the suspension of US security assistance to the Philippines until the Philippine government has made certain reforms to their military and police forces. The complexity is that the US government has been seeking to reestablish its military bases across the archipelago, primarily to preserve its political and economic hegemony over the Philippines. In November of 2022, the US successfully accomplished this objective when Vice President Kamala Harris met with President Marcos to officially allow for the re-entry of the US military. And as a side note, although being the first South Asian vice president for the US is certainly a bamboo ceiling breaking achievement and a testament to the progress of our nation, Harris's position still entails the preservation of a neoliberal system, which is a system that continues to inflict violence on the powerless in the Philippines and all other regions at the margins of the American empire. Thus, the pursuit of representation, although necessary, must not be conflated with the pursuit of justice. Justice-related issues in the US, such as issues of Filipino migrant rights, are deeply connected to the human rights crisis in the Philippines. With the US government sending millions in security assistance to the Philippines, all US taxpayers, which includes many Filipino Americans, are indirectly supporting human rights violations in the Philippines. Many middle-class Filipino Americans are beneficiaries of this oppressive system. So theological reframing. While socio-political issues in the Philippines and its neo-colonial relationship with the US warrant the call for Filipino Americans to be concerned about the motherland, a theological reframing is also helpful to mobilize Filipino American Christians. Expanding one's understanding of the gospel narrative and developing a hermeneutics that brings the reader's whole self while reading scripture may provide this theological reframing. So where are Filipinos and Filipino Americans to locate themselves in scripture? The history of domination, subjugation, and extraction of resources parallels the history of empires as recorded in the biblical narrative. Locating oneself in scripture, though, can be challenging and requires much examination, especially considering how in the US American narrative, settler colonialists identified with the Israelites in their quest to reach the promised land, justifying westward expansion and genocide. However, from the position of those subjugated, the US more accurately parallels the empires of the ancient world. In the conquest of Judea in particular, many Judeans were externally displaced from their homeland to the centers of the Babylonian Empire. Similarly, as a result of US colonization and the ongoing neo-colonial relationship, many Filipinos have either been externally displaced or forced to migrate to seek a better means of livelihood. Thus, the Filipino American experience parallels the story of exiled Judeans navigating their new reality at the centers of the Babylonian Empire. The same can be said when reading the New Testament, specifically for the first century Palestinian context, a region that was subject to the military occupation of Rome. Palestine was located at the margins of the Roman Empire in which resources were extracted for the benefit of those in Rome. In response to this economic exploitation, there was a growing movement of Jewish zealots who believed that violent resistance was the only path to achieve liberation from their foreign occupiers. Jesus' interaction with zealots highlights his location at the margins of empire. The sentiments of first century Jewish zealots parallels the sentiments of the National Democratic Front and other resistance groups in the Philippines who are at the margins of the US American Empire fighting for their liberation. And although we believe that Jesus' ethic of nonviolent resistance is the most effective method to achieve social change, We are also aware that we speak from a position of privilege as people who are not deprived of basic human needs or subject to military violence. Thus, we recognize we are in no position to judge the methods of armed resistance groups. However, we are also aware that these rebel groups are no match against a state military supported by the US government. So there must be an alternative way forward to achieve liberation for the Filipino people. For Filipino American Christians seeking guidance in how they are to engage in the struggle, it's paramount to recognize that the Jesus, according to the biblical witness, is a model for radical political action. The word radical is used in the original sense of the word, which contains the Latin rad, which literally translates to roots. Thus, the radical is not the one who deviates from tradition, but rather the one who returns to the roots of the tradition. And at the roots of the Christian tradition lies the God incarnate, who embodied self-sacrificial love and radical inclusion, who spoke truth to power, who challenged systems of domination, and who pursued peacemaking, justice, and reconciliation. In the Magnificat in Luke chapter 1, Mary's song of praise includes the following. He has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has put down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of low degree. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. In this testimony of the gospel, readers are being told that the one whose birth is now being announced is to be an agent of radical social change. In his first sermon, Jesus picks up the book of Isaiah and reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." In the ordinary sense of his words, Jesus was announcing the imminent implementation of a new regime whose marks would be that the rich would give to the poor, the captives would be freed, and the hearers would have a new mentality, metanoia, if they believe this news. Furthermore, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount presents an invitation to embody a new way of being human that ushers in and materializes the realities of God's kingdom in our world, a reordering of our world that is based on the foundation of love and justice. In The Politics of Jesus, John Howard Yoder notes that Jesus was not just a moralist whose teachings had some political implications. He was not primarily a teacher of spirituality whose public ministry, unfortunately, was seen in a political light. Jesus was, in his divinely mandated prophethood, priesthood, and kingship, the bearer of a new possibility of human, social, and therefore political relationships. His baptism is the inauguration, and his cross is a culmination of that new regime in which his disciples are called to share. So we end this paper with an invitation to the Filipino American Church. You can find parallels with Judean exiles navigating the center of empire. Author Patrick Reyes exalts, God calls us to work on behalf of our communities in ways to which only we have access. Not everyone in Moses' community had access to Pharaoh, just like not everyone in my community had access to the resources, education, and community help that I did. So not everyone has access to the Pharaohs, the Nebuchadnezzars, or the Caesars of the world. And by living in the US, Filipino Americans are more proximate to centers of power and influence, thus can leverage this position to enact social change here and abroad in ways that impoverished Filipinos in the Philippines cannot. And this is why we need the church to rise, specifically the Filipino American Church. The church has the potential to offer a more holistic theological imagination that expands socio-political imagination. As Dr. Melba Magai illuminates, the church is a power by herself, and the source of her power comes from God. Historically, the church has been a genuine alternative center of power when she is conscious of whom she belongs. Such a reframing has the potential to invite our communities into embodying a new way of being human, that is to mobilize Filipino American Christians into action, while also drawing those in activist spaces into a long tradition of faithful resistance, providing them spiritual nourishment to strengthen their loob, the depths of their being, to endure the long struggle for justice that God is calling us to participate in. So we invite you to pray and contemplate these concerns, as prayer is an act of peace and justice for people of exile. We also invite you to create brave spaces to converse about the interconnected stories in your circles. And as you do, we invite you to follow wherever God's Spirit may lead you.
Great. Wow. What a good way to bring the trajectory of these presentations to a call to action. So I appreciate that. I was taking down some notes as you were presenting, both of you. And one of the things that I wanted to acknowledge in your presentation was this reality about neocolonialism. And I think that in a lot of Filipino and Filipino American studies, distinguishing between those two, actually. Filipino studies is more readily conversant with all the isms you're talking about, right? Because it is global in many ways. It's a lot more aligned to the struggles of the poor in the motherland. Filipino American studies, what I've noticed, is very, especially because of the influence, the outsized influence of psychologists, is very concerned with colonial mentality, but doesn't acknowledge neocolonialism as significant as Filipino studies. And I'm just observing how important it is to acknowledge neocolonialism, because what can happen without that acknowledgement is that colonialism and colonial mentality and empire, which are also biblical themes, can easily become subject to the time capsule effect also. So I'm just thinking about how important that is, you know, that you really talk about the ongoing neocolonialism and isms, because otherwise, you know, all these things are past if we're not careful. And that time capsule effect becomes very powerful when we're talking about the Philippines of our parents, or the Philippines of 1898, or the Philippines of the Marcos era. And I think that I just want to appreciate that. What was the book that you cited in reference to the triangle of the three isms?
Philippine Society and Revolution.
Okay.
It's actually one of the banned books in the Philippines.
Hey,
we have access to in the US soil.
Philippine Society
and Revolution.
If it's banned there, let's just acknowledge it more here. Great.
You have an ebook copy if you'd like.
Or airdropping.
That's good. Yeah, we have time for more questions, but I just wanted to acknowledge that and appreciate that aspect of what you're doing. And I know that it's also what you're doing and not just what you're talking about. And I value that so much. So thank you. Other questions, follow-up comments, or encouragements to Bernard and Gillian?
I have a question.
Yeah, Tim.
Thank you for your presentation. It makes me angry to hear some of these things and makes me want to respond. One of the things that I have learned just in terms of mobilizing church communities is I often hear the phrase, it's like trying to turn a cruise ship. That it can be slow, it can be very difficult. And it's like, I feel personally, you know, the call to action, what things do you think would be helpful for helping kind of shepherd a congregation in that direction toward activism, towards mobilization? I guess, do we do that in the spaces that we're in, or do we actually need to create a space? Because I hear also the quote that it's easier to create culture than to change culture. And so just want your thoughts in terms of mobilizing community for those efforts.
Yeah, and a wise sage named Kevin Doy has a, you know, he is like a pastoral ministry guru here for us Asian Americans. Said that you can start changing conversations and start in small groups. Survey your congregation who are in your circles of influence. Who do you think will listen? and do it in such a way that it's do it pastorally, be patient, choose your words wisely, your language, because sometimes we can use combative language and understandably so with our anger, our righteous anger. Also, we can also, think about if we are in a Filipino American church setting, we have first generation Filipino Americans, and then second to third generation Filipino Americans, and they would have different reactions to these issues or concerns. For first gen, our nanais and tautais, our uncles and our aunties, they may have strong reactions because for them, they've already escaped this and they don't want to talk about it. It's quite traumatic. So I think we also have to acknowledge that and be gentle when we start these conversations. And then another I guess challenge is to get that buy-in from the younger Filipino Americans who may not even think of their identity, the hybridity of their identity, and why they should be concerned with issues in the motherland. So I know it's kind of layered, but just going back, it's starting or changing conversations in small circles that you can implement. We wouldn't recommend just going up on pulpit one day and use it as a fun ignite. That would create ruckus in your congregation. You want to add?
Yeah, just to add to that, from another white sage named Daniel Lee, who said that educational is key. Education is key. And so having these spaces or forums where you can present history will allow people to be more aware of these issues.
I think in general, I was thinking about this question, like, what are all the steps to get here to the church? So far away. So it's like, even basic idea of the fact that, oh, being Filipino American matters. What? I thought being a Christian is the only thing that matters. Like, that's where people are right now. So just trying to figure out, like, how do we get to a place? Like, what are all the things, theological things that have to happen? Because those substructures, it doesn't allow for certain things to be understood. It's like, why would they even matter? I don't even think this matters. Even the more basic stuff doesn't matter. Like, even our human identities don't matter. So I think about like just those kind of things. The church, what's the long discipleship of the church? If you're gonna work with the church, I think what Tim's saying is important as well. Like saying, there's one day people just create like other organizations to create, get people who don't have to go to the church structure. Church structure, that's nothing forever, but it also means that you have to like rethink all of discipleship, which will take a long time. So that's basically what I thought about. How do we get here? This is like much further. So how do we get? What are all the steps to get to this place?
Rhetorical question or?
Professional question.
Yeah.
That'll be next year's presentation. Kristen, did you have some? I wasn't sure if you were.
Kristen and I actually talked about this over the summer while we were in the Philippines. There was sort of this in like the social circles. I was seeing a lot of Filipino Americans going back to the Philippines and like making it their own catharsis, but like in the process, they're realizing that the issues stem beyond like what we know to be the issues for Filipino Americans. And I was listening to a podcast while I was there. This woman was staying with a friend in Manila, and she was just like, I've been talking forever about decolonization. I have a podcast I've built around it about Filipino American identity. And she's like, I've never really spoken to you about what the actual issues are facing Filipinos right now of our peer group. And she was like, I'm so glad you said that. And so they had this like, really rich conversation. And the Filipino American woman was like, I've just been so selfish. And so while we were in the Philippines, we were having these conversations. And so I talked to my cousin, who's like 6 months older than me, and we've always been really close. And I was just like, I've never asked you, and we've never actually talked about this. And she was like kind of frozen, like shocked that I was like, so you tell me. And what I got from like her and her sister was that they recognize the problems, they see them. There's a lot of fear in speaking out because they have seen what has happened to some of their friends. They have had like their own mayors disappear or have like bounties put on their heads. And so they've had to go in hiding. Like they, and then they also have this idea that they need to put on like a brave face, that any sign of complaint against anything is this like show of weakness. And so I didn't want to be like, but you guys should be saying something. You should be, especially since they have such like a strong Christian ethic, that I'm like, this should be part of like how you guys express your faith, right? And like, what would you say to those Filipinos of like our general age group, I feel like I'm older than you guys, but of our general age group that like they are maybe like living out in the province, and so they feel a little bit separated, or they're fearful, or they see any sort of protest as like a sign of like personal like criticism as a sign of weakness or something.
Yeah. It's a good question. And it's also very complex because voices of dissent in the Philippines risk their lives.
Yeah.
It's a real, like, that's why Bernard and I feel like we can do more here in this belly of the empire, because somehow we're also protected. We're not, there are no targets on our back as like, as, you know, we're currently like, we're aware of. But if we do that, if we lobby in the Philippines how we lobby here, there'll be targets on our back. Yeah, and we know, you know, clergy and activists who actually were massacred because they were voices of dissent. So yeah, it's a great question. It is hard. You know, we want to empower people and advocate for freedom of speech and exercise their right to protest, but when real lives are at risk, yeah, it is hard. And that's why we are adamant in our presentation that Filipino Americans can do something.
Yeah.
Not everyone has access to Pharaoh.
We're in a unique position where we're not subject to military violence, to where we can speak out, be more vocal as compared to people in the more provincial, impoverished areas. Yeah, while we were in the Philippines, we actually were outspoken about a particular issue, and then the next day at church we received a bomb threat. So it's even like within the city. This wasn't the provincial area. We were in Makati,
the financial district.
Yeah, so more challenging it is over in the Philippines to be more vocal.
There's definitely a difference between anti-colonial and decolonial in this way. And I think that decolonial appeals to people doing psychological work, identity work. But there has to be room for anti-colonialism, where you'll often be people who are more proximate to experience to the resources of the empire and use that framework and logic to subvert the empire from within. And it's a very different posture. I think that's what my work mostly is, but of course we have to have room then for the decolonial if you're doing anti-colonial work, vice versa. But I think often so much of one is sacrificed for the sake of the other. And that itself is a kind of a privilege move as well. I don't have to talk, the privilege to not talk about, or to just psychologize everything about the Philippines. And Carl, you know, one of our familia is pretty adamant about that. I don't know if he'll talk about it. I think I asked him to, but just about repoliticizing the Philippines, because in many Filipino American conversations, the Philippines is depoliticized. And that's also problematic because that's not the context anymore, right? That's cool. Thank you for class. Yeah. Teach. Go with that. Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Well, we have time for maybe one last comment or question before we close up. Oh, I have okay one. This is a vocational question. Last time I talked to the both of you, you expressed that you're discerning some things. Now, we're recording this, and it's gonna end up on the internet, so I'll just remind you to, consider that. But as you recognize the Filipino American churches and pastors' specific roles in this work in the motherland, how does that shape your discernment of your own positioning within God's work in the US? You plant a new church, or do you feel like being part of a non-Filipino context in order to bring the conversation into the mainstream? I'm just curious how that informs you vocationally.
Yeah, it's challenging because we're currently in a predominantly non-Filipino context, and they're quite progressive, justice-oriented, but they're not as culturally competent and aware towards AAPI concerns, and definitely not Filipino American concerns.
But are open.
But they're open, yeah. There's small steps that have been taken to move forward and progress in addressing that issue. But Gillian and I have also been presented with an opportunity to potentially plant a church. And that's something we're still discerning, because it can be or it is a scary thought. But if we were to pursue that route, then we want to create a space that is empowering to Filipino American Christians, but also that draws people in the activists and art spaces to receive spiritual nourishment. So.
Well, we're not there yet. Being in an influential church, we're taking advantage of it. We're part of All Saints Episcopal Church here in Pasadena, and they're known to be one of the most liberal churches in SoCal. They have access to lawmakers, representatives, and so we're like, we are these people of exile clinging into power to make change to our people. So we've done some lobbying visits. We're using the faces of our Episcopalian clergy to be, and that's when we get the attention of our state representatives, that there's this influential church who is concerned about Philippine American relations. So yeah, while we're still discerning, we're looking for ways on what we can do.
Yeah, we recently had a lobbying visit with Judy Chu's office, and she's one of the congresswomen in this area. And many of the members of All Saints are her constituents. So if people start speaking up and are concerned with the Philippine Human Rights Act at All Saints, that's going to concern Judy Chu. So that's the strategy right now.
That's great. We look forward to hearing how it develops, but also working together. Can we give a hand to Gillian? Well, it is 12 o'clock Pacific time, and we're gonna wind down, but I just, I got it. Okay, in the chat, there's a shout out from KP. He'd like to attend. So that next Tuesday we'll be back online for the final segment of our FAMI Mini-Symposium. And these sessions are being recorded and will be posted at a later date. But as always, we're grateful for your time and for this conversation, which is going somewhere. And for all who've joined us, thank you. All right. All right. Have a great week, everybody, weekend, and God bless you till next time. Peace.
Bye. Bye.